Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is a history of the United States of America. Now, this is a relatively an easier history. The United States is a new country. It's not an ancient country. It was created by a people with ancient history. But the United States has only been around, or was started to be created starting in the early 1600s, so about 400 years, which is a relatively short amount of time in terms of world history. Now, of course, before the people started coming from Europe, from the British Isles, there were people living here for, who knows, untold millennia. And that itself is a vast topic of study. And very, very tragically, a lot of that has been lost because after European contact began, when the Spanish actually came first, starting in 1492, the population of American Indians declined horrifically because of disease. So much has been lost. And anyway, that's certainly a topic worthy of study. And I believe the United States is a good country, not perfect. And we should never be afraid to face the mistakes and the consequences in American history. And certainly for American Indians, it was a disaster, the arrival of Europeans. But this is what happened, and it doesn't mean you should hate the United States, but also acknowledge this horrific tragedy because American Indians really lost so much. They lost everything, and many of the nations that disappeared, or they just became, now in the U.S. today, many of them, they're kind of a troubled people. Many of them are kind of troubled with problems with alcoholism and so forth. Anyway, the United States, this is a country in North America, Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, to the east, the Atlantic Ocean, to the west, the Pacific Ocean, and, of course, the overseas states, Alaska up north by the Arctic, next by Canada, and the Hawaiian Islands out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and then some of the territories, Guam further west from Hawaii, American Samoa, also in the Pacific, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean as well. So, and then some more geography, the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern part, the Rocky Mountains in the west, extending into Canada, and then named the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. And then the vast Mississippi River system, an incredible, an amazing river system. Today we don't think of rivers very much because of modern transportation, airplanes and automobiles and so forth. But in the old days, river traffic was the fastest on land. So it gets you faster than walking or riding a horse. And the Mississippi River system is very, very vast, and it drains much of the country and into the Gulf of Mexico. This is a problem the Russians had. Their rivers drain into the Arctic Ocean, which is like a road to nowhere. Anyway, what became the continental U.S., the Southwest was actually part of the Spanish Empire one time, going way back, because then they developed their huge empire from what's now Texas, the Southwest U.S., Mexico, Central America, most of South American parts, much of the Caribbean. And the Spanish also had Florida, so those were Spanish territories established earlier. And the French were in New Orleans and in, what's now Quebec, Canada. Now, the early 1600s, folks from the British Isles, English, this would be Englishmen, English people, Scottish, there were Welsh as well, and the Northern Ireland. They started coming initially to what became Massachusetts and Virginia, those two colonies, early 1600s. You've heard stories of John Smith and Pocahontas, that would be in Virginia. And so these sort of in the north and the south. And eventually there were 13 colonies established by Great Britain on the east coast of North America. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, New Jersey, and so forth. And people were coming, and they're still coming from all over the world. The United States was primarily a creation of Europeans and then African slaves. The African component was substantial. But basically, you could say a European-African creation. And then as time passed, of course, people, and they're still coming from all over the world. Today, a very large Latin American component of the country, and also large Asian as well, and actually more and more new African immigrants. So they were coming from Europe early through the 1600s. Eventually, a lot of people were coming from Germany and Ireland, mostly northwestern Europe, and eventually all of Europe, Eastern Europe and the South, Southeast, the Balkans, Poland, Eastern, Russia, and so forth. European immigrants. But it was a colony of Great Britain, which is the United Kingdom, dominated by England. And so that's why we speak English. The English language became our national language because we were a British colony. And back then, in the 1600s, Great Britain was the world's superpower, and France was often challenged Great Britain for supremacy, and the British really were stronger, and then so they fought a series of wars. Time passed in the 1600s into the 1700s, and there was a war in during the youth of George Washington. Actually, the French were trying to expand into what's now western Pennsylvania. George Washington, that's where he got his military career, fighting with the British forces against the French in Pennsylvania. Now, actually, we had a great actually, we were very blessed by being colonies of Great Britain, because the British developed modern democracy, which is actually a republican government, because democracy is literally the people are the government, and that's not practical. Republican government is where you have representatives who are voted for and accountable to the people. So the British had democracy going back to 1200, the Magna Carta, where they got fed up with their kings and making trouble and wasting money and being abusive. And kings were sharing power starting in 1200 with Parliament, people, an elected body. So that's the ironic thing is the British really gave the world. The ancient Greeks had established democracy, or invented it, you could say, and the British really gave it to the world and helped. This is why the United States became a democratic country. And that's what's ironic, is the British royal family is probably the most famous royal family in the world. Although they really don't have political power. They're they're just sort of glamorous with their various ceremonies and so forth, and the crown the queen wears, and people like that. Anyway, so we were very blessed to be, as Americans, to be colonies of Great Britain. Unlike the Spanish colonies, that didn't have democracy, and for a long time, very long time, struggled with trying to develop democracy because they didn't have that experience. We had that. Now, each of the colonies did have a royal governor appointed by the British, and then an elected body, a House of Burgesses, which we call Congress today. Now, the thing is, as time passed into the 1700s, Americans started getting fed up with being British colonies because they thought the British started being arbitrary, especially the Stamp Act. They passed the Stamp Act. All documents had to pay a tax. And this was, this was a problem. This was an economic burden, especially for lawyers or anyone. So, and then they had this monopoly on tea, and we were actually forced to trade directly with Great Britain. We weren't allowed to trade with other countries. So, as the time passed, eventually Americans wanted independence, and a war started from 1775 to 1783, a War of Independence, the American Revolution, and the great military leader was George Washington, and the war was won. The United States became an independent country, actually 13 independent countries, because each of the colonies became independent states. We weren't one country. And that lasted for a few years, and finally people thought, oh, we need to become one country. So there was a gathering in Philadelphia in 1787 to create a national government, and that was organized mostly by James Madison, who became the 4th U.S. president. And the U.S. Constitution became law. We became one country, 1787, and George Washington was elected the first president. Now, other things that we really helped the country to succeed was the ideas of religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson really promoted that because, in Europe there had been terrible fighting and lack of intolerance, fighting between Christians and Catholics primarily, and persecution of Jewish people. And so, in America, the Anglican Church was dominant actually in the colonies, and there was persecution of Baptists and non-Anglicans. And Jefferson and others said, no, this needs to be a land of religious freedom. So what made America, there were differences that made America was a new country because we were formed by many peoples, and we had religious freedom. And then I think the other thing is that around the world, most countries have traditional culture, and culture is based on large families, cousins and so forth, and aunts and uncles, which sort of pressure people to behave a certain way and follow that culture. Well, American immigrants left their families and they came to America, and so this really weakened traditional culture. That's why Americans really haven't been very much traditional and open to new ideas. And also, American women had more freedom because they really had to do things that needed to be done because they didn't have all these big families to help them. So anyway, the war was won. Although Great Britain was still the superpower, and they were abusive. They would grab American sailors and force them in the British Navy, and people were pretty tired of that. John Adams, actually, the second president, he led promoted the idea we should fight a war of independence. He said, we need to do it. We need to control our own fate. And we can win the war. A lot of people thought, oh man, we can't defeat the British. They're too powerful, the greatest empire in history. But he said, no, we can do it. We need to fight a war, and we can win the war. And we need to, therefore, we need to create state constitutions so we can govern ourselves. So he played a major role in that. And of course, Jefferson promoting religious freedom and education, wonderful things. And the idea of equality, the words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Of course, there was a great hypocrisy as well because there were slaves. So how could we be a land of freedom while slavery existed? So this was a real problem. And people thought, oh, we're a bunch of hypocrites. This is wrong. Anyway, as the years passed, the country developed. Grew early on relatively weak, and the British were very, very powerful. Eventually, there was a war again with Great Britain, the War of 1812, because Americans were fed up with British abuses, especially the grabbing of Americans, forcing them into the British Navy. Andrew Jackson became a big hero in that war, with his leading the defeat of the British in New Orleans. Okay, so time passed into the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution was ongoing, which was based on coal as a heating source and iron to create steel, and then the early product was the first major product was cloth, textiles, clothing, and so forth, and the raw material was cotton. Now we're jumping ahead a little bit, but the United States was moving west. Americans were moving west, and eventually the Louisiana Purchase under President Thomas Jefferson, which brought in a huge, wedge shape from west of the Appalachian Mountains across the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, and then settlers continued to move west, and actually there were a lot of Americans moved into Texas, which was a Mexican. By this time, Mexico had become an independent country, fought the Spanish, and by the early as the decades moved through the 1800s. A lot of Americans were in Texas, and then they fought a war of independence, became independent. They wanted to join the U.S., but it was kind of tricky because they thought, well, we don't want war with Mexico. But eventually, President James K. Polk, he decided we need to fight the Mexicans, and he wanted to take the Southwest. So he prosecuted that war in the 1840s, I believe, yes, and that brought in, and the war was won. It brought in Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona. Huge part of the base of the Southwest. So the years were passing. James, now if you go through the presidents, Washington, of course, led the War of Independence. And was a very good man. And he was the father of our country. He had good character. That's what's so important in life. And he was a good example. And his example helped us win the war, and his leadership and his endurance. And John Adams, second president, who promoted the War of Independence and was very important in bringing French support in the war and French naval support. And then Thomas Jefferson promoting freedom of religion and education and the equality of man. And James Madison, the U.S. Constitution. Wow, what an amazing thing. And a big help to George Washington's presidency. James Monroe, who was a big help in the War of 1812 for supporting Andrew Jackson. And then John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who was a diplomat in various countries and became a tremendous opponent of slavery, because slavery was a horrible thing that was ongoing, a national shame. Really something, life is important. These slaves, they couldn't live their lives. What could be worse than that? And then Andrew Jackson, of course, who was an Indian, as the years passed, part of American history was fighting Indians, because of course the Indians were warriors. They were fighters. They fought each other. They fought us. They fought Americans because they didn't want to lose their land. And anyway, Jackson was a great Indian fighter, fought Indians, fought the British. And then Martin Van Buren, who actually, we became we were a democracy and had developed a two-party system. And Martin Van Buren basically invented democracy as we know it, or the political parties as we know. The Democratic Party, what became the Democratic Party, having an organization and having getting out the vote and so forth. The modern political parties. Martin Van Buren. William Henry Harrison, who was another Indian fighter, defeated Tecumseh. Tecumseh's forces, the Battle of Tippecanoe, and was at the battle when Tecumseh died. Tecumseh trying to stop American expansion, to unite American Indians, to stop them in the Midwest. And then John Tyler was his vice president, who became president, promoted, actually Tyler became supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. It's kind of obviously very, very tragic. And as we mentioned, James K. Polk, who prosecuted the Mexican War that brought in the American Southwest. Now, as time passed in the decades of the first half of the 19th century, the 1800s, more and more Americans in the North thought, oh my God, it's slavery. We have to end the slavery. The abolition movement was dedicated to ending slavery. As I said, John Quincy Adams played a major role in that. Now, the thing is, in the South, we talked about the Industrial Revolution and how manufacturing cloth in factories was the first major product. And the raw material was cotton. So actually there was huge profits being made in cotton. Cotton was like petroleum today. So the Southerners, they're making all this money, and slave labor was the way they were producing cotton. They said, we're not giving up slavery. And they're also worried, I think, what will happen if the slaves are free? Will they seek revenge? They were very scared what happened in Haiti and French Saint-Domingue when the slaves became free and killed all the white people who were either killed or had to leave the country. They were worried about that. And also they're making all this money in cotton. They said no. They were more and more determined to not end slavery. And this eventually led to war, the horrific Civil War, where the South, what's now the Southeast United States, broke away. So we're going to be an independent country. And early on, it was James Buchanan was the president, and he just said, okay, fine. Now we back up a little bit. Zachary Taylor had been president. He was a hero in the Mexican War. And Millard Fillmore, his vice president, who became president when Taylor died, Fillmore, he signed the Fugitive Slave Law, which really was provocative, where actually, slaves have been escaping north. We were just here in the Cleveland area. We were at Lakewood Park. It has the plaque for where the Underground Railroad, slaves escaping from the South. Actually, they ended up going to Canada because these slave catchers were coming north to catch them. And Fillmore had signed the Fugitive Slave Law, which really upset a lot of people. And anyway, the war began. Buchanan said, what are we going to do? And so it was Abraham Lincoln who said, we need to fight a war. We can't break into two. And a lot of folks in the North thought, well, why not? Let them go, especially as time passed, because see, with the Industrial Revolution, military technology had developed, and the U.S. Civil War was so bloody, so many guys getting killed, and medical technology hadn't really evolved. So all these fellows, getting wounded in the battlefield, and then so many of them having their arms and legs cut off because of gangrene to save their lives. People thought the price is too high, because like 750,000 Americans died, soldiers died in the war. Horrific. And if you compare the deaths in the American Revolution, much fewer. People thought in the North, oh my God, let them go. What's the point? There's too much dying, too much suffering. Lincoln said, no, we need to fight. We can't break into two countries. And so his determination and his help primarily from one of his greatest general, Ulysses S. Grant, who became president later himself. Grant was a great military leader, and the North won the war. The Union won, and the United States became one country again. The War of Independence for what's now the Southeast failed, and then slavery ended. Thank goodness. And so the time was, but of course the slaves were not they weren't treated well. It took like 100 years before they really got equal rights under the law. And Americans thought, man, we got to treat these people right. We can't have to stop what we're doing. This is wrong. Anyway, so as the time passed in the 1800s, the United States continued to grow in power, economic power, as the Industrial Revolution continued, and more and more power in the late 1800s. And you'd had the country change from people working in farms, everyone wanted their own land, to working in factories and cities, and really actually tough living conditions, crowded and so forth. But this is what people wanted to do because this was their choice, and of course maybe they lost their farm anyway. So in the late 1800s, the country was growing in economic power. By 1898, we were at war again with Spain. Spain had already lost almost its entire empire, except for the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And the U.S. went to war in 1898 and defeated the Spanish fairly quickly in Cuba. Cuba was taken, Puerto Rico, Guam, and they surrendered in the Philippines quickly as well. Now, the Filipinos fought for a number of years, and it was a pretty tough war, tragic war, but eventually they were subdued, and the Philippines became an American territory. Now, the different presidents we haven't mentioned, time passed. Rutherford B. Hayes was a great hero in the Civil War. Andrew Johnson really kind of failed to help the freed slaves after the war. Very tragic when Lincoln was killed. James A. Garfield from Cleveland, who, he was a very good man, and he was shot and killed. We had a number of presidents assassinated. Chester A. Arthur, who was a New York politician, and then eventually Benjamin Harrison, the son of William Henry Harrison, who'd been president. And then William McKinley from Ohio, from Canton, Ohio, who made the decision that the United States should take the Philippines. And I think that was a good choice because both countries have benefited, the United States and Philippines, because Filipinos are very patient and spiritual and have a good attitude, good spirit, hardworking, good people. They endure. And we've helped, and the U.S. did help them in different ways through education and helping them develop democracy and develop an infrastructure. And so did a lot of good in that country. And then a lot of Filipinos in the U.S. today bring their wonderful positive spirit. They smile and laugh. Good people, patient, hardworking, very, very, very kind. So then we had Theodore Roosevelt, who was in the Spanish-American War himself in Cuba. And we're moving into the 20th century now. And eventually William Howard Taft, who was American governor in the Philippines from Cincinnati, Ohio. And as time was passing, we were growing in power. The United States was growing in power. And then eventually First World War broke out, and the U.S. played a role. Woodrow Wilson was president. And the U.S. Played a role in helping actually defeat Germany and helping Great Britain. We've been allies actually with Great Britain ever since the War of 1812. And the U.S. continued to grow in power. There was the Great Depression in the 1930s, hard economic times, unemployment, and of course it's very debatable. What exactly happened? And Franklin D. Roosevelt. Some people think he was a savior. He saved the country in the Depression. Others say no, that what he was doing actually prevented the economy from growing, because it isn't government that leads economic growth, but individuals, initiative, and so forth. And some say that no, what FDR did, prevented businesses from expanding because they didn't know what the government was going to do next, because they were doing all these different things. And actually, they said, Herbert Hoover didn't do anything. Well, others say no, he was doing stuff that actually prevented recovery. So it's all very debatable. Franklin, FDR. I've been influenced by Glenn Beck. I'm a conservative, so I think FDR. I don't think that FDR was a great president. So anyway, the Second World War came. The United States played a major role, but this time, this was really when the United States emerged as a superpower. Played a major role in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific. And then, of course, right after that, we went into the Cold War, fighting communism, the Soviet Union, our ally in the war. And that was a very tough war, fighting communism, because communism is such a seductive, attractive philosophy. Sounds all very good, wonderful, idealistic, helping the poor and so forth. But the reality is that it takes away freedom. and the government's all powerful, and it's not what it sounds. It sounds good, but it's not. Anyway, we fought the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and went to war in Korea and Vietnam, trying to stop communism from expanding. And of course, now we've eventually got into this war on terror, Islamic Jihad, very, very challenging. And with these as you know, the Muslim world has changed with oil wealth and so forth, and the troubled countries, and then blaming the U.S. for everything. So American history. Here we are in 2019. Yeah, so very interesting. I think we're a good country. I think we've skipped some things as we made our way through history. Various presidents. We have Donald Trump, of course, today is very controversial because people who are very much against him. Barack Obama, the first African-American president, and his father is actually from Africa, and his mother was a European descent, American. And then George W. Bush, who was actually, now we're going backwards a little bit, George W. Bush, who was president in 9/11, of course, when the two airplanes were flown in, taken over and flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. Very tragic. 3,000 people died. This really showed, wow, there's a real problem. Some of these people really hate us, the Islamic Jihad movement. And before him, Bill Clinton, who was very charismatic, before Clinton, George Bush Sr., who actually was in the Second World War, and died recently. Before him, Ronald Reagan, who was a great Cold Warrior, who faced really tough on the Soviet Union and played a major role, I think, in helping the fall of communism and the victory in the Cold War when the Soviet Union stopped being communist. Although today we still seem to be issues with Russia and Vladimir Putin. It's like a dictator. Anyway, Ronald Reagan, who said, no, he said, Chairman Gorbachev, tear this wall down, talking about the Berlin Wall in Germany. And before Reagan, Jimmy Carter, who actually was dealing with problems with the Middle East, in terms of the Americans taken hostage in Iran after the Shah and so forth. Well, it appears we're out of time. Of course, there's a lot more we could talk about. Thank you so much for your interest, if you're interested, and I wish you well. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.